3. Send for Yunanian the Chemist. The Palace and the British Embassy, Hadika City, Narabia. June 18th. King Zayed of Narabia and its dependencies sat in his reception hall and thought about his life. He was, indeed, a king to the outside world, but to his people, among whom kingship was actually proscribed as alien to Islamic thinking, he was still the sheikh. In fact, by Bedouin custom, the sheikh of all sheikhs was known by the plural, ash-shuyukh, the sheikhs. That was the nearest to a king they would allow anyone to be. Traditionally, kings were their enemies, the ancient ones of Egypt, Persia, or Rome. Other desert kings and sheikhs had 4 wives at a time. He now had none. Zarifa had died 20 years ago and he had not remarried. Other desert kings had as many as 200 or 300 sons. He had only one, Jamal of Oxford and California, places where he often preferred to spend his time. This multi-million-dollar Hollywood-style palace had been designed by perhaps the world's greatest, certainly its most expensive, architect. King Zayed's zoo was the biggest in the world, bought as a package from a German firm. His underground nuclear shelter was enormous, and the very best. His fountains, over there beyond the pillars in the marble hall, flowed with rosewater, as had those of the great Caliph Harun al-Rashid of old. But Zayed's money was in Zurich, and his slaves, effectively, included highly sophisticated top executives in business corporations around the world. Arabia, he reflected, was now full of rulers like him. 1 or 2 generations ago, their forebears had been high or low, some desert chiefs, others only poor fishermen, on the Gulf, over yonder, which the Russians in Afghanistan had nearly reached. As chiefs, of course, the kings had claimed the most imposing ancestry, descent from the Queen of Sheba, from Abraham, from other people whose names sounded strange, and were largely unknown to most of the world, but which, in the ears of 150 million Arabs, conjured up pictures of pure magic, the magic of long ago. King Zayed had tried to balance the needs and rules, the customs and the requirements of the old and the new, of Arabia and London, of camel and Cadillac. In conformity with Islamic law, he wore no silk or gold. He did not drink alcohol or smoke. He would not have recognized a pig if he had seen one, and he said his prayers 5 times a day. When the oil wealth came pouring in, especially after the 2 huge OPEC price rises, which the West had called blackmail, he had tried to use it wisely. Now his capital, Hadika City, had the best of everything. Nobody starved. Nobody even went hungry for a day, unless by choice in the fasting month of Ramadan. There were 8 color television channels showing soap operas of life in New York or Blackburn in all its rich intensity to an often baffled audience of 2 million people, most of them still unable to read or write. His army was equipped with weapons so modern that they were not even in service with the countries which produced them. Their armies could not afford the sophisticated gadgetry until their governments had got the money from Narabia or its like to pay for them. His fellow kings were generally much alike. Only that morning he had received a call on the satellite link-up between his palace and that of the king of Narangia. "My wives have just bought a new plane for a trip to Paris," the Narangian had said. "They want to load it up with diamonds or something there, and a new dress designer from Haiti will be in France too. Is there anything they can buy for you?" A servant, a huge fat Nubian eunuch with a gold sash and curly-toed slippers, was suddenly at his side. "Majesty, His Royal Highness presents his homage. Returned from Pakistan, he seeks an audience. The matter is urgent, says the prince, O Majesty the King." "Kafur, tell the prince that I am here, in the divan." The old man leant back on the sofa, tucked his feet under him, took out his rosary, and called for fresh coffee, flavoured with ground cardamoms. What Prince Jamal had to say drove the last, beguiling thoughts of a desert life completely out of the king's head. The Russians' SS-20 missiles in their silos at the Caspian base in the USSR could not reach his country. Now the immense military build-up in southern Afghanistan, with the preparation of missile sites in the Kandahar area only a few hundred miles away, put his entire country at their mercy. The way to Arabia through Pakistan might not yet be open to the Soviet ground forces, but from Afghanistan they could hold the Arab world to ransom. And the oil produced in the USSR might be exhausted by the end of the decade, according to American estimates. Would the Russians move into Arabia? It was true that President Carter had stated years ago that anyone trying to control the Gulf would be repelled by any means, including military force. But what if the Russians used surrogates or puppets, as in Afghanistan? In Asia, Africa, and the Americas, Soviet policy was to use local people as their Trojan horse. And the Afghans? They were anything but a spent force. 3 years after they had been all but written off by the West as a nation hopelessly lost to the Russians, the people were still fighting, so effectively that the guerrillas controlled 99% of the country, and the Russians even had to dive-bomb the cities to regain control. The Russians, of course, were far from being beaten, but they were taking a military and propaganda hammering such as they never had before. The West, on the other hand, was not helping the Afghans. And yet, perhaps to represent themselves as saints, the leaders of the developed world had actually said that they were sending arms. They had the best of both worlds. By not supplying arms and saying that they were doing so, they avoided annoying the Russians, since the Kremlin knew what was, and what was not, getting through. At the same time, all the peoples of the East who sympathized with the Afghan freedom struggle now believed that the West was whiter than white and active in the struggle. The Russians gained on all counts. They had a place to test weapons and, with luck, could convince their own people, and some others as well, that the Western interventionists were trying to fight the Soviet Union through Afghan guerrilla surrogates. And as long as the non-aligned nations thought that the Western powers were giving arms to the Afghans, they would not do anything themselves to help. The only losers in this game of bluff were the people of Afghanistan itself. It was hard to believe, but those were the real facts. The increased supply of arms was due to Afghan patriot, not to foreign, effort. And now, almost incredibly, the Afghans had produced this story, or this fact, that they had found the ancient hidden treasure of Ahmad Shah, billions of dollars worth, and had offered it to King Zayed. To buy arms, to free themselves, to get the Russians out, to remove them some distance at least from Arabia and the other oil states. Jamal. Zayed had made up his mind. This is your mission. I want you to go to Europe, to America if necessary. Search among the libraries there, ask scholars. Is there any truth in the tale of this treasure, and what is its quantity? This sort of information, as everyone knows, is not easily to be found in the East. Even if it is here, it would take us years to dig it out. The scholars and the libraries of the West have centuries of information on the East. By my eyes, father, the prince bowed. I shall have these coins tested, Jamal, to make sure that they are not counterfeit. I shall have it done locally to avoid any interest if they are sent to the West. The press there get hold of everything, and we could have the Russians after us in a matter of days. If the coins are genuine, you shall leave immediately. Your lightest wish is my command. Jamal inclined his head. The king ticked off his instructions on his fingers. Make the arrangements for the stocks and other investments to be liquidated at my signal. Keep in touch through our consulate in Zurich. We can trust Consul Ali Husseini there. I have a direct radio link with him from the palace. When you have confirmation or otherwise about the treasure, radio me in the Mashaf cipher. By my head, eyes, and heart. Jamal gave the salute, touching his forehead, brows, and breast. The king looked at the glittering mohurs once again. He and his old friend, Ambassador Akbar of Afghanistan, had played many a game of chess, gone on many a hawking expedition together. They had watched camel races, had vied with one another in the composition of poetry, had even been adjudged equals in calligraphy. His friend was in trouble. That counted too. Even if the gold turned out to be counterfeit, he would try to do something for him. And the price of gold was going up. Some said that it would double within 6 months. The friend, the gold, the SS-20s, what a combination. First it was recalcitrant camels which had been the bane of his life. Then oil people and diplomats. Now he was haunted by friendship, treasure, and missiles. Well, perhaps things had got so bad that they could only improve from now on. Gold? Testing gold is simplicity itself, Majesty. Methods have been known for centuries, and new ones are being added all the time. Yunanian, the Armenian chemist, bowed with every word he spoke. He had known the king for decades, and feared him. But Zaid had always been good to him, and whenever he called for Atran, there was some commission or some reward never far away. Atran, what do you make of these? Yunanian gasped as the 50 pieces, bright as from the mint, were poured out of a bag onto the table. He took one up and bit it. It's soft enough to be real, Majesty. Perhaps you have found a hidden hoard somewhere near the palace. I could get you a good price. These are collector's pieces, you know, very ancient. No, I was sent them by a friend. They may be of interest to collectors, but millions of them on the market would destroy their scarcity value. I want them properly assayed, and I want it done at once, and I do not want anyone else to know. The podgy chemist looked at the monarch with an expression which combined civility, delight, and injured innocence. Instantly, Majesty, properly and secretly. How could it cross your noble mind, the noblest of all minds, that I, Atran Yunanian, father of Sagdasht Atranian, on whose beloved head I swear, Majesty, that I could ever betray a confidence? Why, I'll kill my wife and child. That won't be necessary, Atran. Just test the gold. How old are the coins, by the way? Atran squinted at them. The lettering was in the Arabic script. Like thousands of Armenians in the Arab world, mostly shopkeepers, he had never learnt to read it, although he could speak the language fluently enough. Oh, they must be 1,000 or 2,000 years old, Majesty. I hope that your chemist art is better than your history, Atran. How do you assay gold, anyway? Sire, there are several methods. In the streak test, you draw it along a hard surface and compare the colour and softness of the streak with that made by a known quality of gold. That's the simplest, but there are alloys which are equally malleable, so it's not much use nowadays. Then there is the acid test. Certain alloys defy acids, but they are generally those made in advanced countries, and as this gold comes from the East, the acid test would probably suffice.
I want a conclusive result, Artran.
In that case, Majesty, I would have to find the specific gravity. This test is foolproof. All metals and alloys displace a different and distinct quantity of water. By measuring this, we can positively determine if the coin is gold.
That is the test you shall do.
When can you report the result to me? This evening at sundown, Majesty.
Very well. Take these coins and go.
May the life of the greatest king, shadow of the Almighty on earth, be everlasting.
Get out, Artran, and take that packet over there with you.
Yunanian the chemist scuttled out, clutching the package wrapped in a fine cashmere shawl which he knew, by custom and experience, contained a fat bundle of currency notes, payment for his trouble. A king, in the East at any rate, always gave people presents which corresponded with his own dignity and importance, not with theirs. Throughout the day, the king faithfully fulfilled his obligations. He read state papers, said his prayers, visited the new dry dock. He also received several relatives who wanted to set up profitable enterprises, such as flying in frozen chickens from California or building 10 new hotels. These would add to the 30 which already stood, monuments to man's inhumanity both in aspect and content, dotting the panorama of bleak hills amid which the capital sat, the highest point on a huge and arid plateau, best suited to Bedouins' flocks and oil rigs, sweeping down to the great flat beaches beyond which was the Arabian Sea and Afghanistan. The hotels, the ambassadors, the docks, and the chamberlains and the oil wealth might come and go, the king reflected, again and again during that day. But the Bedouins, his people, would go on forever. When Yunanian had counted his bakshish and found it to be no less than 500 dinars, worth over $1,000, he took the coins to the little laboratory behind his shop and tested them. Yes, there was no doubt that they were gold, and fine gold at that. The king had got hold of gold. There had been about 50 coins. Why was he so keen to have them analysed? Surely because there must be more, and very many more somewhere. Otherwise he would never have troubled himself to call in Yunanian. 100 mohurs like this would be worth, let's see, at $1,000 an ounce, say about $44,000. Peanuts, though, to such as the king, who already had hundreds, perhaps thousands of millions of dollars in cash, investment and revenues. Yunanian was sure that the king was up to something. But what? What else had he said? Nothing, except to keep it secret. He would go back to the king, taking his report, and try to find out more. As the sun set, Yunanian was sitting in the palace courtyard, waiting to be summoned by the inner guard. He could have got as far as the anteroom where people with business with the king usually waited, but that would have cost money. The guards and ushers knew their services were worth something, and made sure that visitors knew it too. But Yunanian realized that Zaid would call for him in any case, and the guards and the courtiers would have to find him double quick. So he waited. Perhaps there would be another reward, a further bundle of notes, for doing the assay. Someone tugged impatiently at Yunanian's sleeve. It was the palace guard. "Hurry, Armenian, our lord the king commands." The interview was brief. "Well, Artran, are they genuine?" "Perfectly, Majesty." "Good." The king was relieved, and it was this sensation which may have caused his guard to slip. By the way, have you ever heard of a king, an Ajami, a Persian, called Ahmad Shah? I have, of course, Majesty. Yunanian, like many others in the East, always said that. I do not know, after all, is something said only by ignorant people. He had in fact never heard of Ahmad Shah, but it did indeed sound like an Ajami name. Ajam, the dumb. What the Arabs called people who did not know the Arabic language, especially Persian speakers. What do you know about him? That he was a king. That was safe enough. He must be a king. What else? I may need some time to remember, Majesty. Did you hear that he had a treasure? The mistaken belief that Yunanian was trustworthy and that he might really have known something about Ahmad Shah had overcome King Zaid's natural caution. The Armenian stood silent for a moment, wondering what to say. Then, recovering himself, he poured forth such a farrago of nonsense, produced from an overheated imagination fueled by a desire for information and reward, that Zaid soon saw the familiar pattern. All right, Yunanian, that will be all. Tell nobody. Keep the 5 gold pieces I gave you for yourself. Now go. I have important matters to attend to. Yunanian bowed low and backed from the royal presence. Once outside, his mind began to work again. 5 gold mohurs, over $1,500 worth in gold value. As collector's pieces, who knows? They were very old, perhaps worth $25,000 the lot. Not a bad day's work. But there was something else that might bring him even more. The treasure of King Ahmad Shah. That was it. Zaid was a silly old fool. Once a Bedouin, always a Bedouin. He had found a treasure. More likely, someone else had found one and he knew about it. Majesty, perhaps you have found a hidden hoard. No, I was sent them by a friend. Is it gold? Are they genuine? A Persian-speaking king, did you hear that he had a treasure? It must be a really big treasure. That was certain. Yunanian did not know of any Persian-speaking kings who had been anywhere near Arabia, and he could hardly go to Iran or anywhere like that to seek the treasure, especially with so little to go on. No, unfortunately there would be no progress in that direction. Anyway, the gold had already been found. King Zaid's possession of the coins was proof enough of that. So Yunanian would not be likely to get his hands on any more of it. That left him with that other commodity which he knew was often as valuable as any merchandise, though more perishable than any: information. News, like fish, must be sold before it stinks. That was the old saying. He would get onto it tomorrow morning. Roger Lowther was 3rd Secretary and Visa Officer at the British Embassy, Consular Section, Hadika City, Kingdom of Narabia. That, at any rate, was what it said on his office door. In fact, all the visa work was done by the intrepid and officious Miss Hilda Spencer-Starman, technically his deputy. His own title, like that of many another minor intelligence officer in British diplomatic stations around the world, was as improbable as the size and hideous colouring of the immense plaster lion and unicorn coat of arms which surmounted the entrance to the embassy's chancery inside the walled compound. Lowther often winced as he passed below this monstrosity, the size and shape dictated, no doubt, by some London functionary whose desire to impress foreign natives matched his lack of taste. There hadn't been any news for days. Lowther had done the Times crossword and even the one from the Illustrated Weekly of India, once the parish magazine of the Bombay expatriate memsahibs, are now often barely literate, though clearly aping the manners and actions supposed by this generation to have been those of the former elite. Lowther shook his head to unstick his straw-coloured hair from his sweating forehead. He had switched off the air conditioning and opened the supposedly bomb-proof window to get some air, however full of sand and flies it might be. He had sinus trouble, and the chilled air made it worse. He was typical of the dozens, perhaps hundreds, of young men and women who filled the lower echelons of the Foreign Service in London and abroad, and he knew it. He had met too many of them to think otherwise. A third secretary, a dog's body, fetching and carrying for the ambassador, and sometimes only the councillor, spending countless months, sometimes years, in just brushing up your knowledge of Thailand, my boy, of not being able to join his father's London club because ambassadors belonged to it, and it would not be seemly for them to meet him on equal terms. Sitting in on allegedly important meetings which seemed to have a beginning and mercifully an end, but no middle and no easily discernible purpose. Discussions, briefings, situation papers, the same old offices, the same kind of chairs. No, of course, at your level you can't have a Persian rug on your floor. I don't care if it is only a Turkoman saddlebag. Why, even ministers— Lowther's clerk, Halabi, affected a sickly sort of familiarity with him because they were both British subjects, and, as the passports put it, citizens of the United Kingdom. Halabi, who had been born in Aden, now came into the room. He was carrying a cup of tea on a saucer which also held a sodden ginger nut. It must be 11 o'clock. Lowther had passed examinations in Arabic, though he had an execrable accent and hardly knew any of the language, to the great wonderment, respect almost, of all the Arabs who met him. When he had first arrived at the embassy 3.5 years ago, Lowther had asked Halabi to speak to him in Arabic as often as possible, and infuriatingly, Halabi had turned this request to his own advantage. He regularly said sentences in Arabic to Lowther, but in the same appalling accent that was Lowther's own. It gave him great satisfaction. Besides, nobody else really understood what passed between them. The rest of the British staff assumed that it was some obscure Arabian dialect that was involved, while many Arabs imagined that it was an especially polished form of English. Halabi had fostered the latter impression. Halabi now moved forward and adopted a conspiratorial posture, pursing his lips and leaning too close towards the Englishman. Ja Sals all Amwani be kidmatic, he drawled. He was quite proud of that. Anyone with less experience of Lowther speak would probably have said, Ja al-Jasus al-Amani be khidmatak. He was trying for effect, too. It worked, as usual, setting Lowther off like an alarm clock. He leapt from his chair, looked wildly around, and shook his fist at the man from Aden. Halabi, how many times have I told you not to say the Armenian spy is here? Mr. Artran Yunanian is a British subject who comes here from time to see about visa and other matters. He struck out, petulantly and without effect, at a fly which was slowly circling the biscuit in his saucer. Halabi shrugged. He nearly said that nobody else understood their patois anyway, but that would have annoyed Lowther further. One knew when to stop. And put on a clean jalaba. You look terrible. Lowther gazed at the billowing ankle-length nightshirt with distaste. Halabi withdrew, again bowing in that way which Lowther always suspected to be some private joke, or copied from an American film set in Algiers. Lowther gulped his tea and then pressed the button of the intercom. "Halabi, tell Mr. Yunanian I'm on some urgent work and would he kindly wait?" He started to nibble his biscuit, displacing the fly. Lowther had his own style with Yunanian. Once the man had, he believed, been on the point of blackmailing him. Certainly he had behaved with undue and oily familiarity when speaking about certain unusual videotapes for Lowther that had been delivered to his pharmacy by mistake. When he had heard the chemist's story, Lowther's first reaction, as always, was to check it against three things. First, was it true? Second, was it useful? Third, if true and useful, what was it worth? One couldn't waste taxpayers' money. "I don't think that this will be of any interest to us, Artran." Yunanian had been afraid of that. He had spent several minutes trying to get a price for the information fixed before he revealed it. He had even gone so far as to suggest that it was something that the French, the Americans, the Italians even, would give a fortune to hear, if he were just to drop in on their embassies no distance away. Lowther wasn't buying that, and Yunanian had to tell him all. "Now look here," continued Lowther when he had heard the story. "It is of no concern to Whitehall if the king has found gold, or if this gold is treasure, or if this treasure belongs, or belonged, to a man called Ahmad Shah, who sounds like some kind of a Persian. But he might be an Indian, Pakistani, or Afghan. They all come under the South Asian Department. We're responsible to the Middle East Department." "Respected Mr. Lowther, everyone knows that your great Whitehall can use information. Who am I, a poor chemist, to know more about such matters? But I do know, Mr. Lowther, that I have brought you important news in the past, and you have thanked me for it. And anything that the king is doing is always interesting to everyone in embassies. We both know that. And after all, I am a poor man, Mr. Lowther. I have so many children." "I thought you only had one child." "Well, yes, but you know what I mean, Mr. Lowther. Now, you will get promotion, and the Whitehall will be pleased with you. And there isn't much else that you can tell them, because nothing ever happens in Hadika City. I will throw in some information about the North Koreans, who have a big plot to undermine this country, Mr. Lowther, and also something about the cement contract that I have learnt from my brother-in-law, which might go to a British company. All I need is a small amount." "Like what?" "Let us not talk about money, Mr. Lowther, but if you insist, let us say 1,000 dinars. "I'll give you 20 dinars, take it or leave it. Not for information, you understand. Ex gratia, distress allowance. Now, Mr. Yunanian, I have a lot of work to do." "Make it 25. "Done." Lowther scribbled a chit. "Here you are. And forget about the North Koreans. You sold me that story last week. London doesn't believe a word of it. Take the chit to Mr. Halabi."
"I know where to take it. Thank you, Honourable Mr. Lowther. I hope that it gets you promotion and you are soon made ambassador. In Paris."
Yunanian was out of the office like a shot. After all, he had a lot of embassies to visit before they closed for the day. Gold and kings were of interest to everyone. He might sell the story 3, 4, perhaps even 5 times that day. Celesta Brown was depressed. Her Britannic Majesty's ambassador to the court of Narabia sat in his study reading the heraldic news. Narabia was, in the Foreign and Colonial Office classification, a hardship nation. That meant extra money and better leave. True, there was no hardship here as ordinarily understood. Indeed, the ambassador, lacking private means, had seldom lived so well. But there were some things one missed, certain interesting amenities of London's Shepherd Market and Soho, for instance. Now, what was on the agenda for today? The First Secretary brought him a sheaf of papers. London decrypt on the overnight telegrams, Your Excellency. Tiresome fellow, Hoskins. He loved words like decrypt. What was wrong with, here are the telegrams which the cipher room has decoded? Yes, Hoskins?
And, sir, the Russian tanks.
The ambassador sat bolt upright.
Russian tanks? What are you talking about, man? The Russians aren't here yet, are they?
It was just possible, of course. The FCO message had said, experts agree world oil and natural gas may last no more than 40 years, but USSR's only 20 years. Russians are long-range planners, so may try to capture Mid-East oil sooner, and Arabia vital. Hoskins gulped as the ambassador stared fixedly at him.
No, sir, the Russians are not here yet. But you will recall that the Arabians bought some old Soviet military hardware from Egypt after the Russians were kicked out by Sadat, and the Americans wouldn't supply Arabia in case they used US arms against Israel. Well, a British firm is repairing the Russian tanks and supplying spare parts.
Yes, of course. It all came back to Celesta in a rush.
Just a little joke, Hoskins, sense of humour and all that. Quite a useful sideline for British engineering in these hard times, isn't it? Us and the Chinese supplying most of the Third World with spares for Russian armaments. Yes, sir, exactly. Well, you have to see the engineer in charge. Ramsbottom, he's called. He would be. Yes, I remember him. Lowther calls him the Yobbo. And get the specifications from him. He's doing a reverse engineering job. And what might that be? Reverse engineering means taking existing machinery and making blueprints from it so that our people can see the state of the Russians' art. Art, Hoskins? Technology, sir. Well, Your Excellency, these are confidential documents. You have to take possession of them personally. In case the Russians see them? Yes, I suppose so. So you think that they don't already know how they designed and built their own tanks? Those are the orders, sir. I see, Hoskins. All right. London must have its reasons. Send this fellow Plushbottom in. Another of those days. Then Lowther came rushing in. Ambassador, I have something to discuss from the palace. The palace? Perhaps it was a sounding about Celesta's KCMG, Knight Commander. He only had an ordinary knighthood at the moment. Come in, my dear fellow. Buckingham Palace, eh? Hadika Palace, sir. Oh, all right then. Hurry up, will you? I've a lot of things to do before the diplomatic golf tournament. Lowther told him, nasal from his swollen sinus. Can't make head nor tail of it myself. The mention of the palace had unsettled the ambassador. He sat with half-closed eyes, trying to think about the problem of the Persian gold. Instead, a picture of Hobgoblin Pursuivant, an official of the college, or coat of arms, or heralds, or whatever it was, swam before him. Lowther was speaking. So I think we'd better turn it over to mosaic, sir. Mosaic? You mean a pattern of small tiles? Why should you? Are there any around here? Not that kind, sir. Mosaic is the code word for what we usually call jigsaw. Stop playing games and get on with your work like me, Lowther. I've got to, play golf. Not the game, sir. Jigsaw is the man who puts things together. Intelligence information. If we have something perplexing, something that we think might be important, we can telex it straight to Jigsaw in London, and he marries it with other inflow and makes a picture for the Secretary of State. Marries it with inflow. A picture for the Secretary of State. Where did London find these idiots? If that's the procedure, Lowther, why don't you get on with it, man? Why all this fluttering about with games and tiling?
I need your permission, sir. FCO instructions clearly state that Mosaic can only be contacted direct with an upthrust.
Which means?
Inflow and upthrust. Things were getting worse since that circular about use standard terminology only, to be referred to as USTO, of course. Upthrust is the code word for authorization by the head of mission, sir.
I authorize it then. Will that be all, Lowther? Don't just stand there snuffling.
Yes, sir, I'll get onto it right away.
Don't get onto it, get on with it.
The fool was scampering off now. Thank goodness. Upthrust and inflow. What was telexing called? Almost certainly outflow.
Right.
The ambassador pressed the button on his intercom.
Miss Triptych, let me know when Mr. Ramsbottom arrives. I am reading the London decrypts, I mean telegrams.
Yes, Your Excellency. He picked up the first printout. London to all stations. Sounded like a railway announcement. Still, there might be something in this Afghanistan business. 2 tours of duty ago, Celesta had been HBM's ambassador in Kabul, so he knew and liked the Afghan people. They'd give the Russians a run for their money, just as Mrs. Thatcher had reminded people their warriors had done in the case of the British, although she could have put it more diplomatically. A strange country, though, full of all sorts of communities, different from one another, but all fanatical Afghans. The ambassador remembered explaining this as best as he could to an open-mouthed minister of state on tour.
There are many communities here, you see, Minister, all with their own land, flocks, customs and histories. In United Kingdom terms, you might almost say that the Tajiks are their Saxons, the Pashtuns resemble the Scots, the Turks are sort of Vikings, and the Arabs are the Norman conquerors. The Nuristanis, of course, up there in the wild mountains, they're the Irish.
Quite a neat summary, he had thought. But the visitor, primarily a politician, of course, had only refilled his glass with port from the decanter and said lamely, "Of course, that's a great simplification, I suppose."
"Yes, indeed, quite a simplification."
The minister had been more interested, the ambassador remembered, in the size and scale of the huge British embassy at Kate Pawan, the most imposing in Asia. It was built by order of Lord Curzon to impress upon the locals, and the Russians, that the empire was something to reckon with, that the British were the champions of the great game, the struggle for Central Asia.